Right, hello to everyone. You're tuning in today to our webcast, brought to you by Corporate Citizenship and First Malaysia. The topic we will cover today is on how companies can better engage investors on their ESG performance. We're lucky enough to have some fantastic participants joining us today from the investment management industry for a discussion on the topic. So on the line, we have Prue Bennett, who is Head of Investment Stewardship in the APAC region from BlackRock. We also have Benjamin McCarran, who's Managing Director from Asia Research and Engagement, Gladys Chua, who's Head of Sustainability Services from RAM Consultancy, and then from Corporate Citizenship, we have Junius Yeung, who's Director in our Singapore office, and myself, George Blaxall, Consultant in the London office here at Corporate Citizenship. We'll conduct a brief presentation ourselves and then enter a Q&A session with the speakers. We have a number of objectives outlined for this webcast on responsible investment, and what we're looking to achieve from our discussion today are the following. Firstly, achieve a better understanding of how investors use information in their decision-making processes. Secondly, what companies can do about making the most of their communication and engagement platforms. And thirdly, how investor expectations will likely change over the next few years. First off, a few definitions. Often the confusion around the terminology that's used in relation to ESG, sustainability, and responsible investing. They can sometimes have a multifaceted meaning, which can derive different connotations during discussion. So, for the benefit of our listeners today, here are some definitions in the context of responsible investment. First off, ESG. When we talk about ESG, we mean environmental, social and governance issues, things that investors consider in the context of corporate behaviour. It can also be used as shorthand for responsible investment, which is an approach to investing in a way that aims to incorporate environmental, social governance factors into investment decisions in order to better manage risk and generate sustainable long-term returns. Socially responsible investors. These are professionals who seek to combine financial outcomes with moral and ethical returns. Many may target specific themes, such as environmental issues, or a particular social issue that is prevalent in a certain industry. The term has its origin in faith-based organisations that began exclusionary screening their investment portfolios. Companies that were excluded, sometimes referred to as sin stocks, were those that had a certain percentage of their revenue derived from areas such as weapons, tobacco, alcohol and gambling. Mainstream investors. These are large institutional investors and asset managers that allocate capital with the primary purpose of financial return. Long-term value creation. Long-term investment horizons are essentially behaviours in the investment world that play out over a longer term, by which we mean 5 to 10 year horizon. ESG factors by their nature tend to play out over the longer term. Their consideration can be a key part of building long-term value creation for their stakeholders. Responsible investment is an approach that considers environmental, social and governance factors in portfolio selection and management. Over the past 20 years, ESG investing has grown by more than 97% globally by the size of investment funds that incorporate such factors, according to research by Bank of America. Catalysts for its evolution include regulations and guidance, demand from millennials, increasing data and evidence demonstrating the benefits of responsible investment. When it comes to regulations and guidance, a number of exchanges are encouraging widespread reporting on ESG risks and impact. My colleague, Junius, will touch on this further later on in the webcast. From a guidance perspective, the United Nations supported the Principles for Responsible Investing, which was launched in 2006. The guidance and network effect it's been able to demonstrate has proved to be a critical driver for responsible investment worldwide. It also acts as a framework for asset owners, managers, and service providers and TRI. We thought it important to point out how responsible investment is growing in its adoption in investment practices. The earlier definition of mainstream investors being large institutional investors and asset managers that allocate capital with the primary purpose of financial return is certainly true, but the mainstreaming effect sees investors from across the board integrate ESG factors into their consideration and investment management processes. This is in part due to growing evidence that consideration of these factors can help, not hinder, performance. The evidence links the incorporation of ESG factors in the investment process to improve fund performance, lower investment risk, and better risk-adjusted returns. 2/3 of asset management professionals surveyed in the Morgan Stanley and Bloomberg survey say that they are using sustainable investing strategies to achieve competitive market rate financial returns, alongside positive social and environmental impact. In light of these trends, it is increasingly important that companies become more proactive when it comes to demonstrating their ESG performance to the investment community. The economic growth of emerging economies, encompassing population growth, increased consumerism, will create unprecedented environmental stress, but it will also present investment risks and opportunities.
Hi everyone, this is Judith, and I'll take over on the bit on responsible investment in the region. So on a global scale, the trend is clear that ESG investment has entered mainstream decision making, but it's also recognized as helping drive performance. However, when we turn our attention to this region in Asia, we find that the growth of responsible investment practices has been relatively slow to catch on, especially in the Southeast Asian region. In fact, the proportion of SRI managed assets as compared to total managed assets is still very small. According to a study by the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance in October last year, near US $52 billion of funds were managed with responsible investment strategies. That's just 1% of what Europe and the US are investing in today. On the right-hand side, you see the graph that shows the issuance of green bonds. And even here, it shows Asia is lagging behind the rest of the world. At the moment, the largest markets for sustainable investing in Asia, excluding Japan, are Malaysia, which is about 30%, and Hong Kong at 26%. The good news is responsible investment in the region is increasing in terms of awareness. In recent years, we have seen an uptick of SRI events, forums, and panels, especially in Malaysia. Part of this can be attributed to attention by European investors to an emerging market opportunity. Another important factor is regulation. Sustainability disclosures have in recent years been driven by the requirements, in particular by the stock exchanges. Bursa Malaysia, the supporter of this webcast, was actually the first exchange in the ASEAN region to require mandatory CSR disclosures on a buy or explain basis, and has since been followed by the likes of Singapore and Hong Kong. In fact, Bursa has been a strong proponent of responsible investment for a while. Given its role as a market regulator and operator, Bursa has shown strong commitment in the capital market through its initiatives such as the FTSE for Good Index, recognizing companies with strong ESG management practices, as well as building a marketplace for religious and socially conscious-based finance through the Sharia investing portfolio. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor back to my colleague George, as well as open up to the speakers for our Q&A session. George?
Thanks, Judith. Great. So if we could begin with Prue Bennett, who, as I said, is Head of Stewardship APAC at BlackRock. Prue, could I ask you to give just a brief introduction to yourself, your role and responsibilities?
Sure. Thanks very much. I head up what's called BlackRock Investment Stewardship for Asia Pacific. So I'm actually part of a global team, currently at 31, but it is actually growing to 65 over the next 3 years. And I think that demonstrates the commitment that BlackRock, and in particular the CEO, Larry Fink, has for the work that we do. BlackRock is a very large asset manager with now over $6 trillion under management. And in terms of the equities, which account for just over half of that $6 trillion, it's important to understand some of the investment strategies that are used. The predominant investment strategy in this region, and particularly in Malaysia, is passive, where our clients ask us to manage their funds to a particular index. We also have active management strategies where the portfolio manager makes a particular buy, hold, or sell decision in respect to individual stocks. And we also have what's called scientific active equity, otherwise known as quant. Now, our clients are predominantly people who are saving for their retirement. So the focus that we need to have on behalf of those clients is on the longer term. And also because of the predominance of the passive nature of our investing, that is long-term as well, because we can't sell. So we do find ourselves holding stocks which have poor ESG practices, and that becomes our role in investment stewardship becomes even more important, because we have two key tools that we use, and that is voting and engagement. And ESG factors very much influence those activities.
Great. And certainly through Larry Fink's letters, have continued to reinforce the importance of the positive societal impact and long-term value creation capabilities of corporates that you're invested in. How does that translate into some of your engagement with companies on ESG issues and the voting process?
Sure. Well, during the voting process, and it depends which market it is and at what time, we do a lot of engagement with companies around particular issues, including looking at the board. We do look at environmental and social issues through the governance lens, because we believe that having a board comprised of competent directors with a diversity of skills will better understand what the company is exposed to from an environmental and social aspect. And therefore, we see that the environmental and social exposures tend to be managed better than a company with an incompetent board. And as Larry points out in his letter, those good practices are a sign of operational excellence. And so during the voting season, our focus is very much on the board and competency of directors. And we do find that generally in the Southeast Asian region, and I think Malaysia is probably better than most countries, the amount of information that we actually get on the directors and who they are, what their backgrounds are, and what skill set they bring to the board is often lacking, and that can influence our voting decisions. When we engage with companies, particularly outside of the key proxy seasons, we do a thorough analysis of the governance of the company and also what the company is exposed to from an E&S perspective and how those risks are managed. And they will then, those disclosure gaps, so that's where we've identified what the company is exposed to, and there's a lack of disclosure around how that risk is managed, will drive the types of questions that we will ask of the company when we engage with them.
Okay, great. And in terms of the sources that you look to, which sources specifically do you tend to review when you're looking for ESG information and performance over time?
Well, the primary source that comes from the company. Our preference is for all the information to be in one document, being in the annual report, but it is practice for companies to produce a separate CSR report. CSR reports are improving, and I do want to acknowledge the work that Bursa Malaysia has done, being the first exchange to require ESG disclosures of companies, and as you said beforehand, it's now the case with Singapore and Hong Kong, and last year Hong Kong upgraded the requirements to be on a comply and explain claim basis, which I see is very positive. But unfortunately, we still see a disconnect between the disclosures in the CSR report and company strategy. And I've looked at a CSR report for one company, the annual report for the same company, and you really question whether it is the same company, because we're sure the CSR report has been outsourced to a PR company, and the first time the board has seen it is when it's in its published form. So often the CSR report is lacking information about the strategy of the company and how the information of what's being disclosed from a CSR perspective is linked to the company strategy. And I can summarise a lot of CSR reports as having on the first page a picture of the board, the white helmet and orange vest, because they're in a building site usually. Page 2 is a picture of the chairman handing a cheque over to his or her favourite charity. And page 3 is the staff doing a fun run. Now, that's not to say if the board is in a dangerous location, they should be wearing protective hats and orange vests. And it's okay for the chairman to be giving a cheque to his or her or to a charity, as long as that payment is strategic to the company's operation, because it is actually shareholders' funds. And fun runs can be a great way to have cross-functional inclusivity within an organisation and is part of human capital management, but that's not what's conveyed in those reports. That whole strategic nature of what's happening is not conveyed. And so the company, I want to come back to the fact that the company is the primary source of information for us. We do use third-party service providers, a number of them. Some of them have ratings. We don't use the ratings because we see environmental and social issues and how they're managed a direct function of how well the company is governed. So we use underlying data to really identify where the exposures are to the company and how that's being managed. We also use sell-side analysts. I think the work done by sell-side analysts, particularly in the E&S space, particularly climate change risk, has been improving over the years, and we certainly encourage sell-side firms to continue that work. Media is another source of information, so it's a plethora of sources of information that we get, but I can't overemphasize how important it is for companies to disclose how they manage these E&S risks, because some of the service providers that we're using have to rely on publicly available information.
Great, thanks, Prue. And how does some of this information feed into your investment decisions?
Well, the active equity analysts are required to incorporate ESG issues into their individual company analysis, and we have a global approach. We have a screen that they use called the BlackRock ESG risk window, and from an E&S perspective, what that does is highlight what the particular stock is exposed to from an E&S perspective, and then we have a flag which indicates how well it's managed. So it's either black, red, amber, or green. And the analysts are required to do a deep dive on what is driving the particular colour. So if it's a black flag, is it because the particular risk is not being managed? So can we engage with the company and try and change behaviours? Or is it such a risk that the poor management means that it should either be excluded or deeply discounted into the valuation model for the stock? Alternatively, the risk could be managed, but the company hasn't disclosed that. So the service provider that we use has, when it's not disclosed, it has the assumption that it's not managed well. So therefore, that would the analyst can overwrite that and change the flag colour for the particular company. And thirdly, that the data quality is just poor and it's just wrong. And in the Asian region, that is an issue we have with service providers, and that's why we use the data very carefully. So that data is fed into the ESG risk window, and from a governance perspective, we've used our local expertise in Asia to select certain governance metrics that we believe could indicate or have been associated with poor performance going forward. And again, the analyst is required to do a deep dive on those and also work with our team to really work out what the risks are associated with any governance metrics that have been highlighted. Now, it is a global process, so the G process is different in jurisdictions because of different legal requirements and corporate governance standards. The approach to looking at environmental and social issues is a global approach, but it's very much taken into account. And when they have their daily meetings, if there's a stock which has a lot of black flags, the analyst is really required to justify why it's being held in the particular portfolio.
Okay. And then when it comes to engagement, how does this information tend to feed into your engagement, and then who you decide to engage with on ESG specifically?
Well, what really drives our engagement is really our ability to influence. We've invested in many thousands of companies in the Asian region. Some of those holdings are very, very small. And so if we can get a meeting with the company, our ability to influence is quite limited. In other companies, our holdings can be quite significant. And it also gets magnified in this region because of the block shareholder situation if it's a related party transaction. And even though the related party transaction may be straightforward and we have quite a sizable vote, we will still use that opportunity to engage with the company to try and extract governance changes and governance reforms. And so it's our ability to influence. In other companies, we may not be able to get access to the board, or our access it is such a low point in the company that again, putting the resources in to engage probably won't result in a meaningful outcome. So ability to influence is a key driver of selecting companies that we engage in. And then it's also the materiality of the issue and how we think it might impact on shareholder value going forward. So they're the two key drivers of how we sort of select companies that we engage with.
Thanks, Prue. Some very useful insights there. Great. So I'd like to move on to our next guest, Benjamin McCarran, who's Managing Director at Asia Research and Engagement. Benjamin, can I just ask you to give a brief introduction to yourself, your role and responsibilities, and the work conducted at Asia Research and Engagement?
Sure, thank you. Asia Research and Engagement, or ARE, are essentially consultants that integrate ESG into risk processes for investors, banks, and companies. We all have investment and finance backgrounds, so we're good at understanding how businesses create value and whether sustainability or governance landscapes present risk or opportunities to companies on the one hand, and then on the other hand, how the investor processes or the bank processes work and how the ESG considerations can be integrated into them. And we also often work with not-for-profits that have a deep understanding of ESG issues, and that supports us where we're trying to identify the business and financial relevance of those issues. And finally, we help companies and investors communicate on ESG. Great.
And speaking from your experience, how can companies better extend the capacity of their investor relations function in order to help facilitate better ESG engagement?
So there's a number of steps that companies need to take in order to do that. And they need to understand the landscape of, let's call it SRI, so the investor base that is interested in environmental, social, and governance issues. And one of the aspects of that that's very important for any particular company is how interesting is that company from an ESG perspective. And the things that will influence that are how big the company is, what sector it's involved in, whether its activity is either controversial or whether it's a high ESG impact or high ESG dependency sector. And then also the makeup of its shareholder base. And so then a company that has a IR function that's looking to extend into SRI wants to really develop a plan around that. And the plan will include, let's say, creating a register of SRI interests. So what are their top 20 investors? What are their targets from target analysts and portfolio managers that they're really wanting to influence and ensure that they've communicated with effectively? Who are the SRI analysts on the sell side that are writing on these themes about their company or in their sector, and which are the SRI agencies? So we heard from Prue about the different sources of information that they use, and an IR function will want to understand how to influence all of those different sources and ensure that the message is being put across appropriately in all those different contexts. So part of understanding who's interested is who's already communicated with you as a business. Investor dialogue with companies can come through multiple different channels, and the investor relations function will want to try to capture those the levels of interest through various different channels. Sometimes it's through IR, sometimes it's directly to executives, sometimes it's to other members of the board or through the corporate secretary function that questions can come.
Great.
So then the next, go on.
Yeah, and presumably a coordinated approach is certainly more effective than silo communications.
Absolutely. That's certainly a challenge where in many businesses, the investor relations function is reporting up through the finance and sustainability is reporting up through possibly a completely different area of the business. Sometimes it could be facilities management up into operations. Sometimes it can be into other communications or corporate affairs functions in a business. And so making sure that there's a good understanding across the different business units and that IR and sustainability communications are on the same page is very important. And in that, the challenge for IR is to realize that the stakeholder communications part that perhaps another department of the business has been responsible for is something that they're going to need to learn, and the way in which they're going to want to communicate with investors on the issues is a little different to how their colleagues in sustainability communications are perhaps communicating with other stakeholders. So that is a challenge that the IR function will need to step up to over time.
Definitely. And you mentioned both Prue and yourself mentioned about the different service providers and ESG ratings and rankings landscape. We're acutely aware here at Corporate Citizenship that it's a ever-growing landscape and a number of different scores and ratings. How can companies better ensure that they're in control of their own ESG narrative?
So one of the challenges, particularly for Asian companies, is that there's not that many ESG analysts on the ground yet in Asia. So Prue and the team at BlackRock are honorable exceptions. And there are other teams that have engagement capacity or ESG analysts located in Asia. But much of the interest has come out of Europe, North America, Australia, and certainly there's growing interest in Japan. And there's interest is picking up in the region, but it's still a little earlier in terms of adoption. So what it means is that the people who are evaluating companies from an ESG perspective are often located outside of the region, don't understand the local context so well, and are taking their information from different rating systems and providers. So in order to ensure that the company is controlling that message, there needs to be a greater engagement between the company and the different rating providers. And that will mean looking at the different research that's being written about the company, sometimes proactively going and saying, can we see those reports, and then reviewing them, and at the very least making sure that the reports are accurate. Now, that's very frustrating for companies. After all, it's frustrating to feel that why are we supporting somebody else in producing information about us? But the fact is that many of the ratings organizations aren't going to go away. They're funded, they're going to stay there. And if the company's not controlling that narrative and not ensuring the information is correct, then that information is still going to be going out there about them. So it's an unfortunate fact of life. It can take some time, and the best way for an IR function or a sustainability function to handle that is to think carefully about which ratings providers, which indices are more important to them, and prioritize and focus their attention on those ones.
Great. Very useful from a corporate perspective there, Ben. We'll move on to our next panelist. Glad to take over, please, Judith.
Thank you, George. Hi, Gladys. So do you mind just giving a short introduction about yourself and your role and responsibilities within RAM?
Yeah, thanks, Judith. Okay, just to give a little bit of background in terms of my organization, RAM Consultancy is part of the larger RAM Holdings Group, which was formerly known as Rating Agency Malaysia. The group started off in 1990 as a catalyst to the growth of the local debt capital market, which was mooted by Bank Negara Malaysia, or the Central Bank of Malaysia. And we have been around for more than 27 years in terms of credit rating and research services. RAM Consultancy itself, we have carved our reputation in economic advisory, risk management, strategic business consultancy, and other project advisory services since 2000. So in 2016, we have strategically focused our business on the provision of sustainability opinion and services, basically to catalyze growth in sustainable finance within the ASEAN region. So what we try to do is to help investors and companies to incorporate ESG and sustainability considerations within their operation. So basically, our two services are sustainability rating and green bond second opinion review. In terms of sustainability rating, we use it to tier companies based on their sustainability performance. Basically, we rate companies on 3 levels, gold being the highest, followed by silver and bronze. And currently, we have published 2 sustainability ratings out there, with the 2 other listed companies rated on a private basis. So that's on the sustainability rating business. We do also provide green bond second opinion review, which tiers green bonds according to their environmental bent. And we are the first ASEAN-based observer to the Green Bond Principle, which was established by the International Capital Market Association, or ICMA. And we have been contributing actively to market development in sustainability in Malaysia and abroad. And more recently, we've worked with World Bank in terms of industrial capacity building in Jakarta. So as a group, we are committed to sustainability. Our sister company, RAM Ratings, has committed themselves to incorporating ESG also in their credit analysis. And they are a signatory to the UN PRI statement on ESG and credit rating since 2016. So basically, our services are geared towards providing sustainability services.
Great. No, I think it's timely, certainly, especially for the Malaysian market. Can you tell me what aspects of a company's performance are being measured for the purpose of the RAM sustainability rating?
So we try to be as holistic as possible in our analysis because we believe that companies should not only reduce their risk to the environment and society, but we also believe that they should create value in these areas. So based on that philosophy, we look at two components under our sustainability rating framework. First, we look at companies' management of ESG risks that arise from their operation. And secondly, we look at the positive impact that is created from their products and services. Under our framework, we look at companies' ESG policy, processes, performance indicators, controversies, and positive impact. And we benchmark their performance against best practices in the industry. So for example, for our E-analysis, the topics that we look at are carbon emission, energy usage, water, waste, land usage, and supply chain management. That is an example of some of the topics that we look at. And for S, we look at human rights management, treatment of employees, customers and community, and also supply chain. Within our framework, sustainability governance carry a significant weight because we believe that the tone has to come from the top in terms of sustainability matters for sustainability to work throughout the organization.
I see. And sorry, go on.
So companies will have to put in place proper governance structure. That is one of the key areas that we emphasize for companies.
I see. And how does RAM engage with the companies on their ESG performance? Do you rely on their corporate responsibility reports, or do you engage with them directly for the purpose of the rating?
So as a first step, we will get information that are already published by the companies, like what you say. We would use the company's sustainability reports for our initial analysis. Given that, a large portion of listed companies in Malaysia, for example, they've only just begun their journey in sustainability, so disclosures may not be comprehensive enough for us. So the second step that we take is to gather more information through meetings with management of the company, basically to understand their sustainability strategy, and also to discuss ESG issues and request for more information or data where needed. I think a lot more active engagement with companies are required in the region at this moment because they may not be very well versed with some of the topics in sustainability. And basically they're at a very nascent stage at this point in time. So I believe that by doing this, we also in a way, imparting knowledge to these companies. And also we will be able to prompt companies to delve deeper into some ESG issues that they may not have considered.
Yeah, makes sense. That makes sense. Great. Thank you very much, Gladys. That was very helpful. Now I'd like to come to the last question, which are open to everybody, Prue, Ben, and Gladys. This is a question that I'm sure many companies would really like to know the answer to. And this, I'm sure, from your perspective as well, you'd have a lot to share. So the question is, what are some of the existing barriers institutional investors face in integrating ESG into their investment process? Perhaps, Prue, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think that obviously the biggest barrier is the lack of data, and it's also the fact that when companies disclose data, often, as I said beforehand, it's not in the one document, which does make it easier for us. I think another barrier, and this is a real issue for corporates, and I really sympathise with them, is the lack of standardisation around disclosure of the ESG data. And there are a number of organisations like the Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards, the Global Reporting Initiative, initiative, and there's integrated reporting, and lots of options and permutations and combinations of how ESG can be disclosed, and I think a lot of corporates find that confusing, and I think institutional investors have a role as part of their engagement with corporates, to talk about those issues and what they want in terms of that disclosure. The other barrier that we have, it relates to the fact that some corporates view corporate governance and E&S disclosure as a compliance issue as opposed to a strategic issue. And as I've said before, we believe that if you get the board right with competent directors with a diversity of skills, including core industry skills on the board, that board will understand the company's exposure to E&S issues. They will see it as strategic and incorporated into the company's overall strategy, and therefore the disclosure will be more meaningful because it will have meaning to us as an institutional shareholder. And until that message really gets through to the board that this is about long-term value or sustained returns and protecting value for shareholders, the disclosures will always be that perfunctory in nature.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. Thank you. Ben, what about you? Your perspective?
Well, there's a number of different challenges and barriers, and I think just to build on what was just being discussed, one of them is that ESG issues can be very strategic for certain industries, but the time horizon that they act over can be quite long. And if investors it can sometimes be challenging to model those sorts of long-term issues into a view of a company when one's building up let's say, a bottom-up fundamental understanding. So that is one part of the challenge. And a second part of the challenge is that where the companies are viewing these as compliance issues, they're not discussing them in a strategic way with their investors, and they're not educating their investors about the relevance of certain ESG issues, then that actually, again, makes it hard for the investors to work out how important those particular issues are in the context of a company. So the long-term nature, the lack of strategic conversation, that, by the way, isn't necessarily just an ESG issue. Sometimes the time horizon of investor discussions more broadly can be quite short-term. Those are two challenges. I think that there's another one, though, about language. So when we speak to investors, sometimes they'll say, well, no, we're not really sure what we do about ESG. And very often then I'll ask the investors, well, when you're analyzing a company in Asia, do you think about the corporate governance practices and whether or not the controlling shareholder is going to respect your rights as a minority? And very often the first thing that they'll say is, well, yes, of course we do. That's a fundamental part of investment in Asia. So corporate governance typically is considered. And then you might go into sort of a certain examples there is food safety issues in China. And investors may think that they're not really addressing ESG issues, but then if you ask them, well, you're invested in food companies in China, do you talk about food safety? They'll say absolutely yes. And so there's a kind of a definition question, a semantic question that happens in some investors' minds. They are identifying these issues and material on a stock-by-stock basis, but they're not necessarily being systematic in the way that they consider ESG across a portfolio and in all of their dialogues with companies.
Yes. No, I agree with you, and we've actually witnessed a lot of that as well in our job. So very good point, very valid. Gladys, onto yourselves, and I'm sure I would love to hear your perspective, especially with regards to Malaysia in particular. So would you have anything to share with regards to the barriers?
We think that, I do echo what Prue and also Ben has to say in terms of, companies integrating sustainability into their strategy. Companies have to, believe in sustainability first, to be able to then subsequently be able to communicate that to their investors. So currently, the scene in Malaysia is that the barrier will be in obtaining ESG information itself from, reports, in the annual reports or sustainability reports. And also, the other barrier will be, independent information being provided. At the moment, we would not be able to tell whether these information are complete or not. So I think there is some disconnect in terms of ESG information in Malaysia, but I think it is gradually improving with trainings and also awareness. So in terms of what we have found that for investors, I think they would also need some systematic framework for them to look at ESG matters as well for companies.
Yeah, and I think to that point, what Prue had earlier mentioned, sometimes the lack of standardization of these frameworks is also the challenge. So this is, I think, an ongoing challenge that we still face today. So hopefully, over time, that will be addressed as we all come together as viewing it with the same lens. Great. Thank you, everybody. We've come to the end of our webinar. This has been extremely rich in terms of the information and the insights that you all have shared from your various perspectives. We are corporate citizenship and we are a sustainability consultancy. We work very closely with companies, but also with institutional investors and people like Ben and the likes to really understand the challenges being faced in this industry today. So if you have any feedback or even suggestions on other, topics within the responsible investment pillar, please feel free to contact me. My contact details are in the slide, as you can see here. And again, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us. We hope to speak to you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.